Okay, students of Eco 3315, we left when we were talking about how changes in monetary policy tools affect federal funds rate. We talked about how we shift the supply for reserves left or right when the Fed buys or sells treasury securities. We talked about how when the Fed lowers the discount rate, how that could potentially affect the Fed equilibrium federal funds rates. And when the Fed changes the required reserve ratio, which is a little r, which leads to the shift of the demand curve, either left or right, how could that could potentially affect the equilibrium federal funds rate. So let's go further and start talking about the application. I'm not gonna, if you gotta watch the first segment of this chapter because there are two sections of the video. I recorded the first part. That video is basically uploaded at Canvas. So this is the second part. So if you want to understand the second part, you gotta watch the first part. So let's continue because I can't just keep repeating, going back to what I already did. We've been dancing the same on the same thing over and over again. So one thing that I want to talk about, because we say that the Federal Reserve sets like a minimum threshold on interest rates. When the demand curve becomes like kink, it's downward sloping, and then it becomes flat. So the flat portion of the demand curve, remember, establishes the minimum threshold on interest rate. That interest rate is what we call the interest rate on excess reserves. And then the supply curve is vertical, is perfectly inelastic before it becomes perfectly elastic. So on the flat portion of the supply curve, that establishes the what? The discount rate. So ideally, you basically have something like this. You have, if I draw my graph here, so we have interest rate on this axis, and then we have the quantity of reserves on this axis, which you can call R. So we saw that in the previous discussion, we say that the demand for reserve slopes downwards, and then it becomes flat. I'm sorry about the crookedness of my line here. So this is what we're calling the demand for reserves. So the flat portion of that demand curve, we say that that's what establishes the interest rate on excess reserves. When banks decide to keep their money with the Fed, excess reserves, that's how much they get paid in interest. And then we have the supply for reserves is perfectly inelastic, then it becomes perfectly elastic again. So on this top, we're gonna draw this. So that's gonna be the supply for reserve, the RS curve. So the flat portion of the supply curve here establishes the discount rate. So the federal funds rate is obtained at the intersection between the supply, because this is supply for reserves, and the demand for reserves, which is gonna be this point. So this is gonna determine your equilibrium federal funds rate. And then this is your NBR. So I want you to look at this. One of the reasons why the supply curve for reserves is kink, the flat portion establishing the upper threshold on interest rate, and then the demand curve for reserve is also a kink demand curve, slopes downwards and becomes flat, establishing the minimum threshold. The idea is that when the Fed did something like that, that the Fed is trying to minimize fluctuations in what? In the federal funds rate, in the interest rate. So the federal funds rate cannot fall below this interest rate on excess reserves. If the federal funds rate ever falls below the interest rate on excess reserves, banks are just going to continue to accumulate their reserves with the Fed. And then again, the federal funds rate can rise, but it cannot rise above the discount rate, because if the federal funds rate rises above the discount rate, it means the central bank loses its function as a lender of the last resort. That's not going to happen. So anytime the federal funds rate rises and it equals the interest rate on the discount rate, banks are just going to borrow from a Fed. Because borrowing from a Fed and borrowing from other banks, they would be indifferent in terms of the interest rate they pay. Okay, so that's the same curve here. So this is a much better diagram. See, you're talking about like, so no, the key idea here is that if this is the equilibrium federal funds rate, because we are establishing the maximum threshold Federal funds rate cannot rise above this level, neither can it fall below this minimum threshold. So let's say there's an increase in the demand for reserves, where banks are demanding more reserves in the banking system. So the demand curve will shift to the right. So if you think about it, you continue shifting this demand curve. Let's say we shift it gradually, slowly. Once the shift of the demand curve reaches a flat portion of the supply curve, like see this dashed line, further shift of the demand curve to the right will have zero effect on the interest rate. That means interest rates are, as they've already reached their maximum ceiling. And then the converse is true. If you shift the demand curve for reserves to the left, you can see this curve to the left. The equilibrium federal funds is going to fall. But once we hit this flat portion of the demand curve, it cannot fall any further. That means, so by the banks, by the Federal Reserve setting the upper threshold and minimum threshold on interest rate, they're basically trying to minimize fluctuations in the federal funds rate. That's the goal. We don't want interest rate to be so volatile. So we have to set like some threshold where they cannot rise above that threshold, and neither can they fall below a certain threshold. That's exactly what the Fed is doing here. Okay. So now let's discuss a little bit about the tools of monetary policy a little bit further. So in normal times, ever since the Federal Reserve was formed in 1913, if the Fed would reach out for some what they call conventional tools of monetary policy to fix the economy. Let's say the economy goes in a recession. The Fed would go and find out like, oh, what can we do to fix the economy? So tools such as buying, like open market purchase, like buying treasury bonds or treasury securities, would be the ideal tool to fix the economy, because doing that would mean the Fed is going to be lower in the interest rate, because buying bonds leads to an increase in money supply and a decrease in the what? In the interest rate. So it will sound like a routine that this is going to be normal. Economy goes in a recession, no big deal. We know a specific tool to fix it. It's just like you and me. You ride a bike. If your bike chain comes out of your bike, you know a specific tool in your garage or in your toolbox at home that you pull out to fix that chain on your bike. Okay, but what happened was that so these are the tools when the Fed is going to use in normal times: open market operations, buying and selling of treasury bonds, discount lending, and reserve requirements. So let's talk a little bit about that. And remember, I told you guys already that among the 3 or 4 main conventional tools of monetary policy, like open market operation, discount rate, the reserve requirement ratio. Then in 2008, we had another one, like the Fed paying interest rate on what? Interest rate on excess reserves. The most important tool of monetary policy that the Federal Reserve uses about 97% of the time to fix the economy is open market operation. So we need to talk a little bit about what open market operation is. Because if that's the most important tool, conventional tool of monetary policy, it's like you and me. A chain comes out of your bike. The most important tool for me, the most important tool in my garage is a plier. So I go and pull out the plier. If I can't fix that chain of the bike using a plier, that means it's beyond my pay grade. I need to call somebody to come help me out. That's the same thing with the Federal Reserve. The open market operation is their plier, is the main tool of monetary policy that the Fed is going to unleash or pull up when the economy is in trouble. Okay. So there are 2 types of open market operation. There's what we call the dynamic, and there is what they call the defensive open market operation. So I'm going to start with the defensive, even though I listed it number 2 there. The order doesn't really matter. I could have said defensive first before I said I hit dynamic, but it doesn't really matter. So let me talk about what defensive open market operation is first, because it's a lot easier to understand. Then I'm going to talk about the dynamic. Okay, just 1 second. So the dynamic open operation, sorry, the defensive Open market operation is the idea that the Fed sets target on interest rate, target on the federal funds rate, which is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve control, federal funds rate. So if something happens in the market that threatens to change that interest rate, the Fed would intervene. Fed would intervene keep interest rate at its target. So I want to share with you what does that mean. We have to use a diagram to kind of illustrate to you what's going to happen in actual practice. So let's assume that that the Fed has set a target on interest rate, and let's say that target was 2%. Okay, so let's say here was your market for reserves. We have the quantity of reserves on this axis, and here we have interest rate. Let's say this was your demand for reserves. You know how you draw it now. It slopes downwards, and the minimum threshold here determines the interest rate on reserve or on excess reserve. And let's say this is your supply for reserves. So the flat portion of the supply curve determines the discount rate, the ID. And then the point of intersection between the demand and supply of reserves determines equilibrium federal funds rate. And let's say that's the target the Fed has set. And let's say that interest rate was 2%. The Fed wanted the target on the federal funds rate to be 2%. Of course, you know this is your non-borrow reserves here, NBR1, which correspond to this vertical line. So let's say something happened in a market where banks start to crave for reserves. Okay? Let's say American banks decide to, they're demanding so much reserves for whatever reason. Maybe banks want to invest in some new technology, but they need, okay. So that if banks start to crave for reserves, the demand for reserves is going to shift to the what? To the right. And then you can see if the demand shifts to the right because banks are demanding more reserves, this would potentially increase equilibrium. The new equilibrium would be where the black line intersect the red line, where the new supply, this or the new demand curve for reserves intersect the supply curve. So that would potentially increase the interest rate, equilibrium interest rates to say 2.503%. But remember, the Fed has set a target at 2%. The Fed doesn't want interest rate to rise, to go above 2, or neither should it fall below 2%. They want it at 2%. So the question is, what should the Federal Reserve do to maintain the interest rate at 2%? Using open market operation, that would be called a defensive open market operation, because the Fed is trying to defend the target on the interest rate which it has set. So anytime there's an increase in the demand for reserves and the Fed doesn't like it, it wants interest rate to stay at its target of 2%, the Fed is going to conduct what we call a defensive open market purchase. In this case, it's a defensive open market purchase. The Fed is going to buy bonds because buying bonds will lower interest rate back to its target, because interest rate could easily rise up to this new level where the black line, new demand curve, intersect the red line, the supply curve. But the Fed is going to buy bonds so that the supply for bonds is going to shift to the right, like that. So the non-borrow reserves is going to rise because of that bond purchase. So the new equilibrium is going to be where the two black lines intersect, where the new supply curve intersect the new demand gap, which is this point. At point of the intersection, the interest rate is kept at 2%, where the Fed wants to be. So that's what we call a defensive open market purchase. A defensive open market sale happens, is the opposite. Okay, so how does it look like? So a defensive, we can call this a defensive open market sale by the Fed. Let's draw our graph. Let's say, suppose this was our initial condition. Supply, the quantity, demand or supply reserves, then this is going to be the interest rate on this axis. So let's say initially, this was your supply for reserves. The flat portion of the supply curve establishes what? The discount rate. Let's say this was your demand for reserves. The flat portion of the demand curve establishes the what? The interest rate on excess reserves. Then the point of equilibrium between supply and demand, that determines the equilibrium federal funds rate. And let's say that was the target the Fed had said was 2%. So this is NBR, this vertical line. You read national, that's going to be non-borrow reserves. Okay, so let's say something happened in the market where banks were demanding less reserves. If banks start to demand less reserve, that means the demand for reserve shifts to the left, shifts like only the flat, the downward sloping portion shift. So the new equilibrium would be here, potentially. So the new equilibrium federal funds rate would have fallen. But the Fed has set a target on interest rate. How can the Fed defend that interest rate? The Fed is going to pursue what we call a defensive open market sale. They're going to sell bonds, because if they sell bonds, that's going to lead to a decrease in the what? Non-borrow reserves. So the vertical portion of this supply curve for reserves is going to shift to the left. Leads to this thing falling to NBR2. So the new equilibrium now is where the two green lines intersect. So you can see that clearly is going to keep the interest rate at this target. So that's why we're calling this a defensive open market sale. So a defensive market operation, whether sale or purchase, is like the Fed sets a target on equilibrium federal funds rate, and then something happens in the market try to throw the interest rate away, the demand shifting to the left or to the right. The Fed is going to counter that using either defensive open market purchase or defensive open market sale. That's going to keep the interest rate at this target. Okay. Now, the next one is what we call dynamic. The dynamic open market operation. Let's talk about what dynamic means. Okay. So with dynamic, nothing triggers the Fed to change interest rate. The Fed just deliver. Okay, so we're talking about dynamic open market operation. So this is going to be like where the Fed might have kept interest rate, which is a federal funds rate, at a certain level for a period of time. And the Fed now feels like it's time to change interest rate. So then that we would say the Fed is dynamically what? That's a dynamic open market operation. Nothing triggered the Fed. The Fed just, maybe let's say they maintain a low interest rate policy for a long time. And then there's something they fear the Fed might start saying that, oh, maybe there's inflation coming. So it's about time to start changing interest rate to make sure that we don't end up with inflation in the economy. And that's dynamic. Yep. So in terms of the drawing, the dynamic operation is going to, open market operation is going to look like this. So let's say this was the initial situation before the dynamic open market operation happened. So you have the interest rate on this axis as usual. You have the quantity of reserve in this on this axis. So let's say at the beginning of time, this was your supply for reserves. The flat portion of the supply curve establishes a discount rate. This is your non-borrow reserves down here. Okay. And then we have this thing sloping downwards. This is your RD. Flat portion of the demand curve establishes a what? The interest rate on excess reserves. We can just say on reserves. Then the point of intersection between the supply and demand, that determines the equilibrium federal funds rate. And let's say the Fed has set a target on that rate to be 2%. That means the Fed wants that the equilibrium federal funds rate to be 2%. And let's say the Fed has operated this 2% interest rate for a long time. And now they feel like it's about time to change interest rate. Maybe because there's a risk of a recession coming. Then the Fed can start to dynamically change interest rate by buying bonds. The Fed is going to increase bond purchase, buy small bonds. They buy bonds, open market purchase. Dynamic open market purchase is going to shift the what? The supply for reserves to the right. So interest rate is going to fall. Where that green ugly line meets the red line, that's going to be, so the Fed could lower the interest rate to 1.5 by 50 basis points. So this is dynamic. So with dynamic, you see the demand curve for reserve does not shift. Because that would be defensive. Defensive is the idea that something is triggering a change in interest rate, and that could come from a demand side of the market, demand for reserves. That will trigger the Fed to change interest rate or change reserves in the banking system that can keep the interest rate at this target. Here, the Fed has operated this 2% interest rate for a long time. And then they feel like it's about time to dynamically increase that, decrease that interest rate. Maybe they fear the economy may head into a recession. That's why we call it a dynamic open market purchase. That with dynamic open sale, they say the Fed had kept the 2% interest rate for a long time, and they fear that maybe recession, inflation is coming down the road. Then the Fed is going to lower the what? The reserve, total reserves in the banking system by selling bonds, and what's called an open market sale. Okay, so that's what dynamic and defensive open market operation mean. Okay, then the other thing that we're gonna talk about is how does the Fed implement its open market operation? This idea about buying and selling with treasury security. It opens on a computer network called TRAP system. It's very sophisticated. TRAP stands for Trading Room Automated Processing System. I buy some bonds in developing countries in Africa and other places, bonds of governments. That's how you invest too. But in third world countries, there's still a lot, because the technology hasn't caught up yet. There's a lot of paperwork involved. This is something that used to happen in America too back in the days. So if I want to buy, say, $30,000 worth of, say, Tanzanian treasury bonds, I need to instruct my bank, okay, which could be a bank that Tanzanian central bank deals with, but I have an account with that private bank. That could be like Barclays Bank, which is a UK bank, but they're so all over Africa. I can say, well, go and buy on my behalf $30,000, $20,000 worth of treasury securities, so from the government of what? Tanzania. So the government are going to put the bids that they want to sell a certain amount, maybe $100 billion worth of treasury securities. Then the bank that represents me is going to put my bid. They're filling the paperwork, say, oh, I'm willing to, whatever, maybe sell or buy at this price. And then the banks are going to say, after 1 or 2 weeks, they're going to come back with the results and say, okay, we select the best bidders. In modern system where you have high technology, you don't need to do that. The Federal Reserve operates on a trap system. So every bank in the United States is represented by what we call the primary dealers. So Bank of America has got a primary dealers. Their job is just to they work for Bank of America. They wake up every morning and they log onto this computer network called traps. And they basically monitor what the Fed is doing. So when the Fed wants to buy, let's say $100 billion worth of treasury bonds from banks, that information flashes on the screen, meaning that the Fed is inviting bids for banks that want to sell their securities to the Fed, because the Fed is the one buying in that case. And then the primary dealer is going to contact Bank of America or whatever the bank is they represent. If Bank of America gives them a go-ahead, hey, go and do that on our behalf, then they're gonna buy it on behalf of Bank of America. The process takes like 45 minutes. So at the end of the day, they're gonna crunch the numbers within 45 minutes. We're gonna know as a bank whether our bids have gone through. It's an electronic system. Okay. And then there's another concept called repurchase agreement. Repurchase agreement basically is the idea that a bank, the Federal Reserve may want the impact of monetary policy to be short-lived in the economy. They don't want the impact to last long. They want maybe to temporarily buy treasury bonds or treasury securities and then reverse the transaction. So the Federal Reserve can enter into a deal, an agreement with a bank like Bank of America or Citibank, that the Fed is going to sell them a certain amount of treasury securities, maybe $100 billion, with the agreement that the Fed is going to repurchase those things back. They're going to buy it back within 6 months, because the Federal Reserve may not want the effect of monetary policy action to be long-lived in the economy. They want a short-term effect on the economy. So they're going to pursue that. So the opposite of repurchase agreement is a March sale purchase agreement. With a March sale purchase agreement, the idea that the Fed is going to enter into agreement with banks to buy treasury securities from banks, with the agreement that the Fed is going to sell it back to them maybe in 6 months. So that's what those terminology means. Okay. So let's talk about briefly the last thing part of this chapter that's remaining. Let's talk more about what about the discount policy, because the Federal Reserve is the land of the last resort. So the discount window policy is implemented. There are 3 or 4 different types, 3 different types of markets. There's what we call the primary credit market and the secondary credit market. What does that mean? So the idea here is that not every bank that applies for a discount loan at the Fed gets one. Even if they were supposed to be approved for the loan, the interest rate that the Federal Reserve is going to charge to banks is not going to be uniform across all banks. Because just like me and you, we have credit ratings. If you have a better credit ranking, maybe your FICO score is high, your credit rating is high, you're most likely going to get the loan from a bank at a low interest rate than maybe me or somebody else who may not have a high credit rating. Okay, so if 2 banks apply for a loan, but one bank was in bad financial standing, meaning that their credit ratings are not good, the Federal Reserve is going to loan money to the banks that with a bad credit rating in the secondary market. But the bank with sound credit rating is going to be given a loan in the primary market. The difference in the interest rate is always about 50 basis points. That banks in sound financial standing are able to borrow from a Fed maybe at a rate which is 50% basis point less than banks that are in what? Poor financial standing or low credit ratings. Okay. And also there's a term here which you call a Lombard facility. Lombard, there's a small city in northern Italy, a very rich city. So during Middle Ages, that's where there used to be a heavy concentration of banking in Italy. And the key idea was that in the Middle Ages, if you live close to this place, you had easy access to financing because the banks are just around your neighborhood than somebody who's living in faraway location. So if you're living very close to where, in those Italian cities where heavy concentration, then you're going to get the loan at a much lower interest rate. So we call it a Lombard facility. And then there's also what we call the secondary credit market. The secondary credit market, I already talked about that, the secondary and the primary. So banks that are in low financial standing would borrow from a secondary credit market. But the interest rate in the secondary credit market is higher than the interest rate on what? On the primary credit market. And then the last one is seasonal credit. That's what I meant to say. So there are some, the Federal Reserve may want to target industries or sectors of the economy that lend funds to to seasonal activities like skiing. We know skiing is mostly a winter deal. Is the peak season is in the winter time. So the Fed might want this industry to boom, but banks may not have enough money to make it boom by lending money. So the Fed could give loans to banks that are willing to engage in specialized lending in specific industries, like construction, like mining, like as I told you, like skiing, because these are seasonal activities. So the Federal Reserve is a lender of the last resort at the end of the day. So the other thing that is now remaining, I'm not going to waste my time talking about them because we talked about it in the past. You can talk about the financial crisis of 2009, 2007. It's going to be repetitive. There's nothing new. But as I said, there were non-conventional tools to monitor the policy because in 2007, when the financial crisis hit, interest rates in America are already close to zero. So the question is, how could the Fed lower them to make them negative? The answer is, of course, no, because we didn't want the interest rate to be negative, just like we saw in Japan in the 1990s. So the Fed started to come up with unconventional tools of monetary policy, things that were not tried before. That's why we call them unconventional tools, non-conventional tools of monetary policy, like this large asset purchase from Wall Street. Okay, bailing out several high-profile firms. So, but then the Fed also came up with what they call the forward guidance during a financial crisis because the economy was so weak in the financial crisis that many businesses needed assurance from the Fed that they were going to keep interest rate low so that they could recover. So the Federal Reserve adopted this forward guidance where they basically assure businesses that the federal funds rate which the Fed targets would not change for a long period of time, would be close to zero, like it was. So there are several policies. But I'm just going to, if you want to study more of them, just go through the slides. I'm not going to go through each of them one at a time. What about the monetary policy tools of the European Central Bank? They also do open market operations, the main refinancing operations, weekly reverse transactions, longer term refinancing operations. Then the European Central Banks also lend money to banks, charge marginal lending facility, marginal lending interest rate, deposit facility. Reserve requirements. It's only 2% of total amount of checkable deposit. In the United States, could be a little higher. So they also pay interest rate on those deposits, so the cost of compliance is low. So when banks deposit money with the European Central Bank, they're going to pay some kind of what? Interest on those funds. I think that's about it for this chapter. So this is the second portion of chapter 15. Make sure you watch the video. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna arrive in Austin Tuesday about 7 p.m. And then on Wednesday, I'm gonna record the last chapter, which is a fairly short chapter, chapter 16. So make sure you watch the video of this chapter 15, because I'm going to assign and give you guys an assignment to complete in chapters 15 and 16, which I'm going to be recording on Wednesday morning. I will also upload at Canvas the review sheet for the final exam this Friday. So when you wake up tomorrow morning, you should be able to find a review sheet at Canvas. So you start studying for the final. Thank you. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.